At 10:20 in the morning on June 4, 1942, four Japanese aircraft carriers were steaming northeast of Midway Atoll in the central Pacific, their flight decks packed wingtip to wingtip with fully fueled aircraft. Akagi, Kaga, Huryu, and Soryu, the striking arm of the finest carrier force ever assembled, had spent the last hour absorbing a series of uncoordinated American attacks, level bombers, torpedo planes, marine dive bombers, and had swatted away every one of them without losing a single ship. Not one American torpedo had found its mark. Below decks, Japanese aircrews were racing to rearm their planes with bombs for a second strike on the atoll behind them, while on the bridge of Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo believed he had roughly 15 more minutes before he needed to worry about anything else. He did not have 15 minutes. He had 5. At 10:22, lookouts on the Japanese carriers spotted specks in the sky, high above, dropping out of the sun in near-vertical dives. Within 5 minutes, some accounts say 6, 3 of the 4 carriers of the Kaido Budai, the fast carrier striking force that had opened the war at Pearl Harbor, were burning wrecks, their flight decks blown open, their hangars turned into ovens of exploding ordnance and aviation fuel. It was not, in the end, much of a battle. It was an execution, and it took less time than the walk from a parking lot to a movie theater. Here is the detail almost nobody puts in the highlight reel. The squadron that found the Japanese fleet at the exact moment it was most vulnerable did not find it because of brilliant reconnaissance, a clever flight plan, or a lucky guess about Japanese intentions. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from USS Enterprise had already burned through most of their search time on an empty patch of ocean, flying in the wrong direction based on outdated contact reports, low enough on fuel that turning back was becoming the responsible decision. What actually redirected 33 dauntless dive bombers onto the single most consequential target in the Pacific War was an American submarine that, by every conventional measure, had just failed its mission. That submarine fired torpedoes at a Japanese battleship an hour earlier and hit nothing. The story of how a botched submarine attack became the pivot point of the entire Pacific campaign is not the part of Midway people remember. It is the part that actually explains what happened. To understand it, rewind about 18 hours to a Navy intelligence basement in Pearl Harbor where a small team of codebreakers was arguing that they already knew where this battle would be fought. By the spring of 1942, the war in the Pacific had gone almost entirely Japan's way. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japan had seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma, sinking or crippling most of the American battle line, and pushing British and Dutch naval power out of Southeast Asia entirely. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet, had opposed the war with the United States from the start, on the grounds that Japan could win battles but could not win a prolonged industrial war against American shipyards and steel mills. His answer was to try to force a decisive fleet engagement early, before American production advantages could compound, by luring the remaining American carriers into a trap at a place the Americans would feel compelled to defend. He chose Midway, a tiny atoll roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, home to an airfield and a seaplane base that made it a legitimate outpost worth fighting for. Yamamoto's plan, codenamed Operation MI, was enormous and complicated even by the standards of Japanese naval planning. A diversionary strike on the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north, a midway invasion force of transports carrying roughly 5,000 troops, a screening force of cruisers and destroyers, and Nagumo's 4-carrier striking force sent ahead to smash Midway's defenses and destroy whatever American ships responded. Yamamoto himself commanded the operation from the battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind Nagumo's carriers, close enough to claim overall command and far enough away to be functionally irrelevant to the battle that would decide everything. It was, on paper, an overwhelming show of force. It also depended entirely on one assumption that turned out to be false, that the Japanese knew something the Americans did not. They did not. A team of cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor's Combat Intelligence Unit, Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had spent months chipping away at the Japanese Navy's JN-25 operational code. By late May, Rochefort's team had partially reconstructed enough of a coded Japanese message to know that a major operation was targeting a location the Japanese referred to only by the letters AF. Rochefort was convinced AF meant Midway. Senior officers in Washington were not fully convinced, so Rochefort's team arranged for Midway's garrison to send an uncoded radio message reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down and the base was short of fresh water, a message with no operational value except as bait. Within days, a Japanese intercept referenced AF as being short of water. The deception confirmed the target, the approximate date, and critically, the approximate composition of the Japanese carrier force. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, now knew roughly what was coming, when it was coming, and from where. He had 3 carriers to Japan's 4 Enterprise and Hornet, plus Yorktown, hastily patched together at Pearl Harbor after battle damage that Japanese planners assumed would keep her in dry dock for months. Nimitz positioned all 3 northeast of Midway, hidden, waiting for a fleet that believed it held every advantage of surprise. The trap Yamamoto had built for the American Navy was about to be sprung on the Imperial Japanese Navy instead. Nagumo's 4 carriers were, ship for ship, the most experienced and battle-tested naval air force on the planet in June of 1942. Akagi, his flagship, had been laid down as a battle cruiser and converted to a carrier under naval treaty limits in the 1920s. One of Japan's original fast fleet carriers, and a veteran of Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, Darwin, and the Indian Ocean Raid. Kaga, similarly converted from a battleship hull, carried a large air group and an equally experienced crew. Soryu and Huryu were purpose-built fleet carriers, faster and more modern, both blooded in the same string of victories. Between the 4 ships sailed roughly 248 aircraft, A-6M0 fighters that had, to that point in the war, never lost an even engagement to an Allied fighter, D-3A Val dive bombers, and B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, the same aircraft type that had gutted Battleship Row 6 months earlier. Their aircrews were not green replacements. Many had flown every major operation since December, and their proficiency in coordinated strikes was, by 1942 standards, unmatched anywhere in the world. Nagumo himself was a torpedo and destroyer specialist, not a career aviator, a detail that mattered more than his rank suggested. He commanded the most sophisticated air power in the Pacific, while privately admitting to subordinates that he did not fully trust his own instincts about how to use it. That gap between the tool and the man wielding it would matter enormously in the hours ahead. So would something else. The same tactical doctrine that had made this carrier force devastating against fixed targets and unprepared fleets was rigid and slow to improvise, built around sequence strike packages that assumed the initiative would always belong to Japan. On June 4th, for the first time in the war, it did not. There was also a simpler, more human dimension to Nagumo's predicament that rarely makes it into summary accounts. He was not a naval aviator by training or temperament. He had spent his career around torpedo boats and destroyers, and he had inherited command of the Kaido Butai in part because of seniority rather than any deep personal expertise in carrier operations. His staff included officers who understood strike aviation far better than he did, and the tension between his caution and their more aggressive instincts shaped several of the morning's slower, more hesitant decisions that, individually, looked reasonable, and that collectively left his 4 carriers exposed at the worst possible moment. The plan that would undo Nagumo's carriers was built by a man almost nobody outside naval history circles has ever heard of. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser commander with no prior carrier command experience, thrust into tactical command of Enterprise and Hornet's task force only because Admiral William Halsey, the officer originally slated for the job, was hospitalized with a severe skin condition days before the battle. Spruance was methodical, unglamorous, and almost pathologically undemonstrative, the opposite in temperament of the swashbuckling carrier admirals both navies tended to celebrate. His plan, built with his chief of staff Miles Browning, was to hold the American carriers back, out of range of Japanese scout planes, and launch a full strike the moment Japanese carriers were located, rather than waiting for a textbook-perfect coordinated attack. It was a bet that speed and surprise mattered more than polish, and it required Spruance to send his aircraft out in a ragged, poorly synchronized launch. Fighters, dive bombers, and slow torpedo bombers departing over nearly an hour, with no real plan for them to arrive over the target together. Spruance also had to work around a serious material constraint. Several of his torpedo squadrons were still flying the Douglas TBD Devastator, an obsolete design already recognized within the Navy as too slow and too lightly armed to survive modern anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. He sent them anyway, because Midway itself was at stake, and there was no time to wait for a better airplane. It was not an elegant plan. It would turn out to be exactly the right one, for reasons Spruance could not have fully anticipated. Spruance's own force was also operating with a coordination problem baked into its structure from the start. Enterprise and Hornet sailed together under Spruance's tactical command, while Yorktown operated as a separate task force under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the senior officer present, and therefore the man in overall command of the battle, even though his own carrier had been patched together in a frantic 72-hour repair job at Pearl Harbor after severe damage weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Fletcher and Spruance never sailed within visual signaling range of each other for most of the engagement, coordinating instead by radio and by inference, each launching his own strikes on his own schedule with only a rough sense of what the other force was doing. It was not the kind of unified, tightly synchronized command structure that either Navy's pre-war doctrine called for, and it meant that when Enterprise's and Yorktown's dive bombers converged over the Japanese fleet within minutes of each other that morning, they did so almost by accident rather than by plan. Midway's own defenders threw everything they had at the incoming Japanese strike, and at Nagumo's fleet through the morning, a chain of small, costly attacks that individually accomplished almost nothing, but collectively bought time and stripped away the element of surprise. Marine Corps fighter pilots flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes rose to intercept the Japanese raid on Midway and were shot down in droves by superior Zeros. Army B-17 bombers dropped high-altitude bombs on the Japanese carriers, and as they had against Japanese transports 2 days earlier, hit nothing. Marine Corps Vindicator dive bombers and Navy PBY patrol planes made torpedo and bombing runs against the Japanese fleet through the mid-morning, taking heavy losses for no confirmed hits. If you are looking for a moment to see how thoroughly the American position depended on foreknowledge rather than luck, look here. Even with Rochefort's intelligence, Midway's land-based air power failed to land a single significant blow on Nagumo's carriers before the decisive strike arrived. What these uncoordinated attacks did accomplish was psychological and tactical rather than material. They forced Nagumo to keep his fighters aloft and burning fuel, kept his flight decks in a state of interrupted rearming, and most importantly, set up the single worst-timed decision of his career, one that would leave his flight decks packed with armed, fueled aircraft at the exact moment American dive bombers arrived overhead. By 9:20 in the morning, the situation on Nagumo's flagship had become genuinely difficult. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet, 15 obsolete devastators under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, located the Japanese carriers and attacked alone, without fighter cover, flying straight and level into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and diving Zeros. All 15 aircraft were shot down. 29 of 30 men died. Only Ensign George Gay survived, hiding under a seat cushion in the water and watching the rest of the battle unfold from the surface of the ocean. It reads, from the record, as close to complete waste as a military operation gets. An entire squadron annihilated without scoring a single hit. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked minutes later and suffered similarly, losing 10 of 14 aircraft, again without a confirmed hit. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 went in next, at almost the same moment, and lost all but a handful of its own aircraft, again without sinking anything. 3 squadrons, roughly 40 aircraft, thrown into a fleet defended by dozens of Zeros and a wall of naval gunfire, and not one torpedo found a target. Whatever this was, on its own terms, it was not a victory. But it accomplished something the men flying it could not have known. It pulled every Japanese combat air patrol fighter down to wave-top height, chasing slow torpedo planes across the surface of the ocean, and left the sky above the fleet, the direction from which dive bombers attack, almost completely empty. At almost exactly the moment the last torpedo attack was being cut to pieces, Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise, low on fuel after an hour and a half of searching an empty ocean on the strength of a stale contact report, were on the verge of turning back for their carrier. What changed his mind and changed the outcome of the Pacific War was a wake. Below him, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, cutting a straight white line across the water at high speed, racing to rejoin the main fleet after breaking off to depth charge an American submarine, USS Nautilus, that had attacked the Japanese battleship Kirishima and missed. McCluskey made the decision to follow the destroyer's wake rather than turn back, correctly calculating that a Japanese warship in a hurry was almost certainly heading back to its carriers. Minutes later, he crested the horizon and found all 4 Japanese carriers laid out below him, decks crowded with aircraft, combat air patrols scattered at sea level chasing the last of the torpedo bombers, and no fighters left at altitude to intercept him. At almost the same time, 17 dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived independently from a different direction, having taken a more direct and better calculated route. 2 separate American dive bomber groups, launched hours apart with no coordination between them, converged on the same fleet within minutes of each other by coincidence rather than design. Neither commander knew the other was there until they saw each other's aircraft in their dives. What followed, beginning at approximately 10:22 and lasting perhaps 5 to 6 minutes, is as close to a clean kill as carrier warfare has ever produced. McCluskey split his group, sending part of the squadron under Lieutenant Commander Richard Best against Akagi, and the rest under Lieutenant Earl Gallagher against Kaga. Best's group scored at least one direct hit on Akagi's flight deck, detonating among the armed and fueled aircraft spotted for launch, igniting secondary explosions that tore through the hangar deck, and set off a chain reaction the crew could not contain. Gallagher's dive bombers put at least 4 bombs into Kaga, the largest of the 4 carriers, turning her flight deck and hangar into a single continuous fire within minutes. A few miles away, Leslie's Yorktown squadron dove on Soryu and scored 3 hits in rapid succession, each one striking a ship whose decks, like the others, were packed with fueled aircraft and staged ordnance for the second strike against Midway that Nagumo's flight crews had been racing to prepare. The bombs themselves were not enormous by later war standards, but they did not need to be. They landed in the single worst possible condition a carrier can be caught in: flight deck crowded with fully fueled, partially armed aircraft, hangar decks stacked with bombs being swapped from anti-ship torpedoes to land attack ordnance, fuel lines charged and exposed. Within minutes, Three of the four most powerful aircraft carriers on Earth were beyond saving, their crews fighting fires that outran every damage control effort available to 1940s naval technology. Japanese sailors who had spent the morning confident of another easy victory now fought, without panic and without complaint, to save ships that could not be saved, continuing to man anti-aircraft guns and damage control stations even as the decks buckled and burned beneath them. A discipline under total collapse that the record credits plainly, without needing embellishment. Nagumo himself had to be physically persuaded to leave Akagi's bridge. He transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara only reluctantly, as his flagship became an unrecognizable hulk of twisted, burning steel around him. American losses in that same window were not trivial. Enterprise alone lost more than a dozen Dauntlesses in the course of the morning's attacks, some to anti-aircraft fire, some to fuel exhaustion on the long flight back after the extended search that had nearly sent McCluskey's squadron home empty-handed. Several American pilots, having expended their fuel margin finding and attacking the Japanese fleet, ditched in the open ocean on the return leg and were never recovered. The 5-minute strike that broke the back of Japan's carrier force was not a bloodless one for the men who delivered it, even if its cost was dwarfed by what it inflicted in return. Only Hiryu, positioned several miles from her three sister ships, escaped the initial strike entirely, and her air group, under the aggressive Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, launched 2 counterattacks that afternoon against the one American carrier they had managed to locate, Yorktown. The first Japanese strike at midday put 3 bomb hits into Yorktown, stopping her boilers and leaving her dead in the water. Her damage control teams performed a near miracle, restoring power within roughly an hour, only for a second Japanese strike, torpedo bombers this time, to put 2 torpedoes into her port side that afternoon, causing a severe list that finally forced her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, to order abandon ship. Late that afternoon, American dive bombers from Enterprise located Hiryu in turn and put 4 bombs into her flight deck, setting off the same kind of uncontrollable secondary explosions that had already claimed her 3 sister ships that morning. By nightfall, all 4 of the carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were burning wrecks, 3 of them already sinking or scuttled, the 4th soon to follow. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with Hiryu rather than be rescued, a decision entirely consistent with the era's naval code of honor, and one that cost the Imperial Japanese Navy one of its most capable and aggressive carrier commanders at the exact moment it could least afford to lose one. Return, now, to that submarine wake. USS Nautilus, an aging fleet boat operating under a captain who had already survived a near-miss depth charging earlier that morning, fired torpedoes at the battleship Kirishima and scored no hits, an outcome that, filed on its own, reads as a straightforward operational failure. But the destroyer Arashi's decision to break off and hunt Nautilus, and its subsequent high-speed dash back to rejoin Nagumo's carriers, created the single visible clue that redirected Wade McCluskey's fuel-starved, off-course dive bomber squadron onto the exact heading that put it over the Japanese fleet within minutes of Yorktown's independently arriving group. Without that failed torpedo attack, without that wake, it is entirely plausible that McCluskey's squadron turns back for Enterprise having found nothing, and the Japanese carriers complete their rearming, launch their second strike, and the battle unfolds along entirely different and far worse lines for the United States Navy. One of the most decisive victories in naval history hinged, in the final accounting, on an American submarine that missed. While Nagumo's carriers burned, a second Japanese operation was unfolding roughly 2,000 miles to the north, in the Aleutian Islands, almost entirely disconnected from the disaster taking shape at Midway. Japanese naval aircraft struck the American base at Dutch Harbor, Alaska, on June 3rd and 4th, and Japanese troops landed on the islands of Attu and Kiska in the days that followed, seizing American territory for the only time in the entire Pacific War. It had been conceived as a diversion, intended to draw American naval strength north and away from Midway before the main battle began. Instead, American code-breaking had already told Nimitz which operation mattered, and the Aleutian landings proceeded almost exactly as planned, a tactical success that captured real ground and cost Japanese lives to defend, all in service of a diversion that never diverted anything. No blame for that mismatch belongs to Yamaguchi, Nagumo, or the sailors who fought and died defending Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu that morning. The failure was strategic, made in planning rooms weeks earlier, and the men in the Aleutians would spend the next year holding barren, fog-bound islands that had already lost whatever purpose they were meant to serve before the first Japanese soldier waded ashore. Lay the day out in order, and the speed of it becomes almost unbelievable. On June 3rd, an American PBY patrol plane spotted the Japanese invasion force roughly 700 miles from Midway, and Army B-17s attacked without result. At 6:30 on the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway Atoll itself. By 7:00, American carrier task forces had begun launching their own strike aircraft. At 7:15, Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed for a second strike on Midway, a decision he would shortly reverse and then be unable to fully undo. Through 9:20, 3 separate squadrons of American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese fleet in succession and were nearly annihilated without landing a hit. At 10:22, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived almost simultaneously, and within roughly 5 to 6 minutes, left Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu ablaze beyond saving. By noon, Huryu's counterattack had crippled Yorktown. By late afternoon, American dive bombers had found and mortally wounded Huryu in turn. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone or going down, and a battle that began with Japan holding every material advantage ended before midnight, with the balance of naval power in the Pacific fundamentally and permanently changed. Several distinct factors converged to produce that outcome, and none of them alone would have been sufficient. The first factor was intelligence. American code-breaking at Station Hypo gave Nimitz the target, the approximate date, and the approximate order of battle weeks in advance, allowing him to position an outnumbered force exactly where it needed to be rather than searching for an enemy that could have struck almost anywhere in the Pacific. The second factor was Nagumo's rearming decision, forced on him by the arrival of scattered American attacks and a delayed scout report from a float plane launched half an hour late off the cruiser Tone, a mechanical and procedural failure that meant Nagumo learned of American carriers in the area later than he should have, at precisely the moment his flight decks were most cluttered with fueled, armed aircraft. The third factor was the sacrifice, whether by design or consequence, of 3 American torpedo squadrons whose attacks failed to sink anything, but succeeded in pulling every Japanese fighter down to sea level, clearing the sky for the dive bombers that arrived minutes later. The fourth factor was raw coincidence. 2 American dive bomber squadrons, launched separately with no shared plan, converging on the same target within minutes of each other, one of them guided there by the wake of a destroyer chasing a submarine that had already failed its own attack. The fifth factor was doctrine and material condition. The same practice of packing Japanese flight decks with staged, fueled aircraft that had made Kaido Butai's strike so devastating against Pearl Harbor and against Midway itself became, in the space of 5 minutes, the mechanism of its own destruction, because a carrier with armed aircraft on deck and fuel lines charged is a carrier one direct hit away from an uncontrollable fire. It is worth being direct about what the record actually supports and what it does not. The popular telling of Midway often reduces the American victory to sheer luck, 3 carriers happening to be in the right place, dive bombers happening to arrive at the perfect moment, a battle won by chance rather than preparation. That version is not wrong about the role coincidence played in the final minutes, but it badly understates the deliberate work that put American forces in position to benefit from that coincidence in the first place. Nimitz did not stumble into positioning his carriers north of Midway. He did it because Rochefort's code-breaking team had already told him, with real confidence, where and roughly when the battle would occur. Luck decided the final 5 minutes. Intelligence, planning, and a willingness to accept badly uneven odds on the strength of that intelligence decided that the United States Navy had 3 carriers waiting in ambush at all. Midway marked the last time in the Pacific War that the Imperial Japanese Navy would hold numerical superiority in fleet carriers over the United States Navy. Japan began the battle with 4 carriers to America's 3 and ended it with none. American shipyards would go on to launch dozens of fleet and light carriers over the following 2 years, a pace of construction Japan's industrial base could never approach. By 1944, American carrier task forces would routinely outnumber anything Japan could put to sea by a factor of 3 or 4 to 1. In that sense, Midway did not simply win a battle. It foreclosed, in a single afternoon, any realistic path by which Japan could have contested command of the Pacific through carrier air power again. It was also, in a narrower sense, one of the last major naval engagements in which a numerically inferior fleet, lacking any material advantage in ships or aircraft, overturned a superior opponent almost entirely on the strength of intelligence and a 5-minute window of tactical opportunity, a combination that would not recur at that scale for the rest of the war. The aftermath was, for the Japanese Navy, an exercise in silence rather than reckoning. Surviving aircrews and sailors returning to Japan were kept isolated from the public and, in some cases, from their own families, to prevent word of the defeat from spreading. The Imperial Japanese Navy publicly reported the battle as a victory for months afterward. Admiral Nagumo continued in carrier command through further defeats in the Solomon Islands campaign before his career quietly wound down. He died by his own hand in 1944 as American forces overran Saipan, choosing suicide over capture along with much of his staff. Admiral Yamamoto, who had gambled the entire operation on a decisive early strike, was killed in April 1943 when American fighters, guided by continued code-breaking success, intercepted and shot down his transport aircraft over Bougainville. The same intelligence advantage that had doomed his carriers at Midway ultimately finding him personally, less than a year later. USS Yorktown, torpedoed and sunk by the Japanese submarine I-168 on June 7th, while under tow after surviving 2 separate Japanese airstrikes, rests today more than 3 miles down on the floor of the Pacific, found largely intact by an oceanographic expedition in 1998. Akagi and Kaga were located in the Pacific in 2019 by an undersea survey expedition, their wrecks confirming much of what the written record had already established about how quickly the fires had spread through their hangar decks. Kaga in particular was found broken into several large pieces on the seafloor, a physical record of just how violently her stored ordnance had detonated once the fires reached it. No memorial marks the spot on the open ocean where any of the 4 Japanese carriers went down. There is only the water, and since 2019, sonar imagery of hulls resting more than 3 miles beneath it. Vice Admiral Nagumo's own reputation never fully recovered within the Imperial Japanese Navy either, despite the fact that the intelligence failures and the delayed scout report that doomed his carriers were substantially outside his control. Naval culture in Tokyo preferred a narrative of individual misfortune to an honest accounting of the code-breaking advantage the Americans had held for weeks before the first bomb fell. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's 15 aircraft, spent hours in the water watching the Japanese carriers burn from a hiding spot beneath a floating seat cushion before being rescued the following day. He lived until 1994, one of the last living witnesses to a squadron that was wiped out without sinking a single ship, and that nonetheless helped clear the sky for the strike that decided the battle. That is the story this channel exists to tell, not the version that fits neatly into a single dramatic image, but the one built from the actual timeline, the actual intelligence record, and the actual decisions made by men who mostly could not see the whole picture they were part of. If you want more of this kind of history, the kind that survives contact with the primary sources rather than just the highlight reel, subscribe and stay with us. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us which battle you think deserves this same treatment next.